So let's start to build our two-player logic, and I'll zip through this pretty quickly. But the concept here is that we want to build a couple of game-level attributes. So I'm making sure that the inspector game tab has been selected, and I'm going into attributes. This is the same place where I built player one score. So while I'm here, I'm going to create another integer attribute, and I'll choose, and I'll call this, you guessed it, player two score. Now, I need to build two more attributes, at least according to my logic. The way that I'm going to control this is by having two different booleans. Now, technically, we could probably do this, as I'm thinking about it, with one boolean, and just say whether, if it's on, it's player one, and if it's off, it's player two, or whatever. But I think it'll be a little bit easier if we just create a boolean. We'll call it this will be I'll call this player one. Okay, so or we could call it active player one, so whether or not player one is active, but I'm just going to shorthand it and call it player one. And you can see that the Boolean value is either off or on, or otherwise it's false or it's true. Okay, and I'm going to leave it at false or leave it off, and I'm going to create another attribute. It's also going to be a Boolean, and I'll say choose, and I'll call this one player two. And I will also leave it false. And so the concept here is that we have two variables that are being tracked. We have player one score and player two score. So we'll have two different scores. So in other words, I need to test to see if player one is the active player or if player two is the active player, and that way we can divvy out the points accordingly. Whether we get it right or whether we get it wrong, the active player is going to receive that either earn points or receive negative points. So in order to do this, what I need to do is I need to build some kind of buzzer actor. And what the buzzer is going to do is it's going to flip the switch. And based on a key press input, it's going to either set player one to true or player two to true. And then we'll have to go back and kind of iron out some of the details of this. So by default, when the game loads, we have these attributes. I have player one, player two score, they're both set to 0, and player one and two are both set to false or unchecked. I'm going to go back to my actors tab. Now, on my question one scene, or actually on every question, we're going to need a little actor hiding in the corner that acts as our buzzer. I'm going to call it a buzzer. So I'll create a new actor. I'm going to call this buzzer. And really the function of this actor is to switch the Boolean based on user input. So I'll just kind of set this to a color that really jumps out. And the name, I actually don't want buzzer 2, I want it just buzzer. And I'll hit the back button. And now I'll assemble the logic, or I could just drop it on stage first and then assemble logic. It really doesn't matter which way you do this, but you definitely don't want to double click on the actors on stage because these are instances of the object. We actually want to assemble the logic over here inside the actor inspector. Double click. So I'm looking at my buzzer attributes, and what I want to do is I want to create a rule. And my rule is that when this actor receives not a mouse position, but a key press or a key down, and now we have to choose which key is down. I'm going to click on this keyboard button, and that will bring up a graphic of the keyboard. And I'm thinking of this is going to be my player one rule. And I'm imagining that two people are sitting around a keyboard, and that if player one presses the Z button, it's going to, we're going to set it to change the attribute. We're going to make the player one true. We're going to make it active. So what we'll do is we'll use that same change attribute action that we used before, but I'm going to drag and drop this into my new logic here. And we're going to change this attribute. The attribute we're going to change is the player one attribute. So I'll double click on that. And we're going to change the player one attribute to, we want to set it to true. Now remember, Booleans are either false or they're true, and our Boolean started out as false. And so we want to set it to true. Now that there's a little trick here, we want to go into the expression editor, so we get this little equal sign, and all we're going to do is in lowercase, we're going to say true. So we're going to write true and hit the check mark. So in other words, we're changing the player one attribute manually to true if we press the Z key. So here's the logic. The buzzer's sitting on stage for question one, and if I'm player one and I press the Z button, I've set my Boolean to true, or in other words, I'm the active player. We want to do the same thing for player two. We'll create a rule, and this rule is going to be a key press. And the key that we're going to press is something on the right side of the keyboard. And I'll just use this backslash key. And we'll change an attribute. And the attribute that we're going to change here is the player 2 attribute. And we're going to set that Boolean to true. And I'll hit the check mark. So currently, when the buzzer's on screen, when question 1 comes up, we can either press the Z key or the backslash or the question mark key. And that will activate the player. And later what we'll do is we'll assign the points based on which player is active. Currently I can't really test this. I mean, there's a couple different ways I could test it. But I'm going to assume that my logic is working just fine. So I'm simply flipping on or off a real quick switch. And that switch is the player 1 or player 2 Boolean. Starting out false, I'm setting it to true, and I'll assume that that's going to work just fine. And I'll build a simple test here. I'm going to go into my wrong answer. And what I need to do is make another rule. And so what I want to do is I want to test just not to see if this object's been pressed. So in other words, if I click on the red button, not only do I want to see if the red button's been clicked and then add to player score 1, what I want to do is I want to see not only has it been pressed, but is player 1 set to true? And I can do this by creating a new rule. There's a couple different ways I can do this, but I'm going to create a new rule. And rather than an actor receiving an event, I'm going to test an attribute. And the attribute I want to test is player 1. And I want to test to see either if it's true or false. And it comes up default with true. Okay? And so I want to rearrange this logic a little bit. I'm going to take the change attribute for the player score and throw that into my attribute test. And I'm going to take that attribute test and throw that into my touch event. So follow me here. The logic is if I click on the red button, okay, if it's clicked, it's going to test to see is player 1 set to true. If so, it's going to subtract from the score. In other words, this assumes that I've buzzed in as player 1. I click on the red button, it's going to subtract from my score. So currently now I should be able to test this. And there's a couple of different ways I can test this. Remember, my player status is both player 1 and player 2 are set to false. So I should be able to click on the red button and nothing should happen to the player 1 score. Click, click, nothing's happening. Okay, because it's testing to see is player 1 true. It's currently not true. Okay, I can make it true by pressing the Z key. So I just pressed the Z key, and now when I click on the red button, it's functioning just as it should. It's starting to subtract from my score. That's a good thing. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'm going to go back into my wrong button, and I'm going to see this logic through for player 2 as well. Now, I could just build this from the ground up, and I'll do that, but I could also just copy this whole entire rule and change player 1 to player 2, game player score 1 to game player 2 score, and then change these values as well. But what I'll do is just for the sake of reinforcement, I'll create a new rule. And I'm just going to use this as a model, so I want to receive a touch input when it's pressed. I'm going to create another rule and then test to see if my player 2 Boolean is true. So I'll drag and drop that, and I'm looking for an attribute. And the attribute I'm looking for is player 2. And I want to see if it is true. So in other words, is it active? And if so, I want to change the player 2 score attribute. So the attribute I want to change is player 2 score, and I want to change it to player 2 score minus, because I'm on the wrong answer, minus 10, and I'll hit the check mark. So now I should be able to test buzzing in as player 1 or player 2 and seeing if that score will subtract. But I have a little bit of a glitch, and I'll just go back to my scene 1 to remind you of that glitch. I have a player 1 score object here that renders the value of player 1 score. This was just simply a little placeholder. This actor 1 was a placeholder. I'll get rid of that. In fact, I'll get rid of even actor 1. That was just a little placeholder to test the logic of my scene from moving from one scene to the next. I wanted some kind of visual cue to show that I changed from one place to the next, and that is no longer serving its purpose because I already have a really nice visual I know that I'm changing from the loading scene because the loading scene says so. It's the loading scene. And then it kicks me over to this mock-up of question 1. Well, I need a new actor. And this actor, its job is going to render player 2 score. Okay, just like we have player 1 score over here on the left side, this one is going to render player 2 score. Now, just like I did with player 1, I'm going to double click. I'm going to go into the color, and this is just for, kind of aesthetics sake and still being able to see the button. I'm going to take the opacity way down, and I'll close that. Inside the logic, what I want to do is I want to display text. And I'll click, drag, and drop. And the text that I want to display is not a string or static text. I want to display the value of player score. Okay, so that is now being rendered. And if you remember, if we go back to, if I go back and I look in my game level attributes, I already have a player score. I created that when I created the 2 booleans as well. Its value is 0. So if I hit the preview button, I should have 2 player scores up. This is player 1, this is player 2, both of them equal 0. I also have a buzzer that if I buzz in with the Z key, I activate player 1. If I buzz in with the question mark key or the backslash key, I activate player 2. The green button does not work. The green button still just kind of, in an unintelligent way, assigns a +10 value to the current value of score 1, but we'll fix that later. Let me test my question 2 buzzer, so I'll hit the question mark. So now when I hit a red button, it should subtract from this score over here. I'll click, and there we go. That's working just fine. So my wrong question logic is working pretty well. I still have some glitches in my logic, and I'll talk about those in the next presentation. But now I want to fix my right answer button. And so I'll do that really quickly. I'll jump back. I'm going to go into my correct answer. And the logic that I want to build, I'll just get rid of the original logic that I had, and I'll build this from the ground up. So I'm going to create a rule, and the rule is that I'm listening for a touch. And when that touch is pressed, I want to create another rule because I want to test to see which is the active player. So I'm going to test for an attribute as well. And I'll go into my game attributes, and I want to test to see if player 1 is set to true. And if so, remember, this is the green button. This is the correct answer. So I want to bump up the score. I'll change the attribute. I want to bump up the score of player 1. So I'm going to go into game, player 1 score, and I want to change that to game, player 1 score, plus 10. So in other words, if I've buzzed in as the active number 1 player, or I've buzzed in number 1 as the active player, if that's true, and I click on the green button, I will be assigned 10 points. All right, so I'm going to create a new rule, and now I'm going to build the logic for if I've buzzed in as player 2. So first I want to test to see if this green button was touched in the first place. I want to create another rule that tests to see which is the active actor. And I can do that by testing an attribute, which I've called player 2, and I want to test to see if that one is true. And if it is true, I want to change the attribute of the player 2 score. So I'll go to player 2 score. Player 2 score equals plus 10. And I'll hit the check mark. So again, the logic here is when I click on the green button, basically if player 1 is true, do all this stuff. If player 2 is true, do all this stuff. And that's all contingent on the fact that we've clicked on the green button. So I've clicked on the green button, now it tests to see which one is true. If player 2 is true, it takes the current value of player 2 score, and it takes that value and adds 10 to it. So now what I can do is I should be able to check by switching my logic back and forth, and I should be able to click on any one of the buttons. So I'm going to save what I'm working on. Not sure what that's about, but I'll do a save as. Maybe I inadvertently changed the name. So it's a good time to do a file save as. I'll call this quiz04. I'll give this a quick preview. So I have my loading screen. I'll change that later when I'm thinking about the design. And now I have no active player. I have not buzzed in, so I should be able to click on all these buttons and they don't do anything. Okay, but the moment that I hit, say, the Z key, I've now activated player 1, and I should be able to subtract from the score, and I should be able to add to the score, depending on which button I click. Obviously, I still have some work to do to be able to change. I only want to be able to select this once. But if I hit the question mark key now, and I click on the green button, I'm bumping up the value of player 2 score. If I hit any of the red buttons, I take away from the player score. So the core logic of the player switch and keeping track of the two individual scores is now working properly. The next thing I need to do is I need to squash a few bugs. I need to be able to press on a button and go to the next question. I also need to be able to keep the buzzer from being able to switch back and forth while the question is active. In other words, imagine, if you will, that both of my players, and I'll just hit the question mark. So I have both players are currently set to true at this point. So I'll have this issue where as I click on the wrong answer, both of them are changing because I don't have anything that's resetting that value. In addition to that, if I came into this question kind of as a clean slate, so let me go back to question 2 and I'll reload. Question 1, and I'll reload my game. I'm coming in, the state of my active player is both set to false. Well, I have nothing keeping me from activating player 1 and now activating player 2. Now they're both set to true, and so whatever button I hit, I'm adding to both scores. So I need to correct for that. And there's a couple of different ways that I can correct for that, and we'll do that in the next presentation.